Welcome to the Italian Culture Institute. Thank you for your patience. We had some logistic kind of issues, but we're done now. Thank you for being here. I'm Valeria Rumori, the director of the Italian Culture Institute. And tonight, I'm extremely honored to host a very special guest, world-renowned music director, conductor, Maestro James Conlon. Tonight, through a guided listening, Maestro Conlon will present Giuseppe Verdi's masterpiece, Don Carlo. Don Carlo will open on September 22nd at Dorothy Chandler Pavilion and will run through October the 14th. We hope this presentation will inspire you all to attend one of the upcoming performances. I would like to thank once again Maestro Conlon, as well as the musical assistant to James Conlon, Maestro Ignazio Terrasi, the LA Opera Director of Institutional Giving, Marlinda Menache. Thank you, Marlinda. The LA Opera Director of Marketing, Eric Bornman, and Christina Ward for their precious collaboration with this event. Thank you to you all. So I would like also to acknowledge the presence of quite a few of our friends from the Diplomatic Corps, and some of them I'd like to say welcome officially. The Consul General of Germany is, comes directly from Rome, actually. So welcome to the Italian Culture Institute. We invite you to refrain from using your cell phones during the whole presentation. Thank you. Now, please welcome to the stage Marlinda Menache, who will offer us a sneak peek info of the upcoming 2018-2019 LA Opera season. Thank you, Marlinda.
Thank you, Valeria, and we are so thrilled on behalf of LA Opera to be here tonight. It's always an honor every year when the Italian Cultural Institute hosts us here and really presents such a lovely program at the beginning of our season. And we have a very exciting season, which will open with Don Carlo for 6 performances beginning this Saturday night on the 22nd. It will be followed by an array of very diverse performances and productions, including Satyagraha from Philip Glass, Hansel and Gretel, Mozart, The Clemency of Titus, and then we move into the final of the season, El Gato Montes, which is a zarzuela, and will feature Placido Domingo again. And then finally, we close the season with a famous La Traviata. So we would love for all of you to attend, and we have a little snippet of what the season will look like and sound like on our screen for you right now. So please attend.
Viviamo nei lieti calici che la bellezza infiora e la fuggevol ora s'inebria voluta viviamo nei dolci fremiti che suscita l'amore poiché quello che ho al cuore onnipotente va viviamo amore amor fra i conici più galli baci avrà viviamo fra gallieni più galli baci avrà
As you can see, not only do we feature productions on our main stage, but we are also in many different venues across the community in smaller, more chamber works that are more experimental in nature. And so I invite you to grab some programs on the way out that will give you, and that you can take home and that you can peruse over and go to our website. And we hope that all of you will join us over the course of the season and see Maestro Conlon, who will be conducting many operas for us on the stage, and we are thrilled, we would be thrilled to have you there. Thank you so much. Valeria?
Thank you, Marlinda. And now it is my true honor to introduce this time Maestro James Conlon. Mr. Conlon is one of today's most versatile and respected conductors. He has conducted virtually every major American and European symphony orchestra since 1974. His debut with the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. He has led more than 270 performances at the Metropolitan Opera and has conducted at the leading opera houses in Milan, Vienna, Petersburg, St. Petersburg, London, Rome, and Florence. Through worldwide touring, an extensive discography and videography, numerous writings, television appearances, and guest speaking engagements, he has become one of classical music's most recognized figures. He is music director of LA Opera, where he leads, among others, Verdi's Don Carlo and La Traviata in the 2018-2019 season, and is also principal conductor of the Rai National Symphony Orchestra in Turin. Among his numerous prizes are 4 Grammy Awards for recordings with the LA Opera, a prestigious 2002 Légion d'honneur from France, and in 2018, recently, also, he has become a Commendatore Ordine al Merito della Repubblica Italiana from Sergio Mattarella, the Italian president. Now, please, give me a very warm round of applause in welcoming to the stage Maestro James Conlon.
Thank you very much for technical problem. This is since this isn't updated. Questo è l'esperto. Guarda che cosa mi fa. Bisogno di un altro. Comunque non si preoccupi, io comincio comunque. Bravo. Ecco, maestro Terrassi, che
Ha salvato la situazione. Good evening to everybody. I'm very delighted to be here once again. It's becoming almost an annual tradition now to come to the Istituto every year to speak about one opera or other, but very often about Giuseppe Verdi, because of course not only is Giuseppe Verdi one of the world's great composers, if anybody represents Italy culturally and from a humane point of view, it's Giuseppe Verdi, who I'm once again very honored to be with you and speak. I'll take 1 minute to greet all of our Italian friends. Buonasera, sono onorato di essere qui con voi, come ieri. Vorrei salutarvi nella lingua di Dante, che è la nostra lingua, infatti. Benvenuto e spero che ci vediamo anche all'Opera di Los Angeles quest'anno e soprattutto per Don Carlo. So I'm going to talk a lot about Don Carlo, Don Carlos, Don Carlo, who's who, who's Don Carlos, who's Don Carlo, why is there a difference, about the extraordinary historical basis that this opera is very different from many of the operas that we are accustomed to seeing, and why is it so important? Why is it important in the output of Verdi, and to put it in some kind of historical context, not just the history of Don Carlo and the Spanish family of the time, but also to put it in another perspective, that is the perspective of the interpretation or the use, or you might even say the misuse of the characters of the real historical personalities, because I'll also try to point out in the course of the evening that opera is not history, opera is opera. It may serve itself or use history as a muse, as a point of starting, but it is not, in fact, history. But that being said, I'm going to start with a, we'll see if there. Yep. Let me back up. There. Okay, so we all know Giuseppe Verdi. This photo was taken very close to the time he premiered Don Carlos in France. Now, I'd like to point out that Verdi wrote 2 operas for Paris. The subjects, the Sicilian Vespers, I Vespri Siciliani, as it's known in Italian. The opera was called Les Vespres Siciliennes, and it was written in French for the French. And the second opera that he wrote for France was Don Carlos. And as I'll point out later, this was both a great inspiration and an enormous problem to Verdi, that he was writing for a form of operatic theater which was not completely natural to him and required more ingenuity from him. Now, let me move that ahead. This opera is based largely on of a theatrical work, theatrical poem, one could say, but a theatrical work, Don Carlos by Friedrich Schiller. Now, Friedrich Schiller himself, one of the great German writers, and of course a great inspiration to many over the 2 centuries since his over 2 centuries since his life and death. Most of you will know, if you don't know Schiller directly, by reading any of his poetry or any of his works. You'll know him every time you go in and hear the Ode to Joy of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony. You may not know it, but you're listening to Schiller. And he was a great humanist. He came of age in the Age of Enlightenment, and he embodied those concepts, those very concepts of which we our own country here in the United States was formed. That is, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the equality of all persons. These were revolutionary ideas 250 years ago. Schiller was a part of that revolution and contributed greatly to it through his literature in Germany. This won the heart of Giuseppe Verdi rather early on, because of course he, in his way, was a champion of the common man And he was, of course, a great believer in the importance of self-determination on the part of the emerging Italian state. In other words, the Italy that was in the form of unifying itself. His life spanned before the unification of Italy, and he was a great hero of that unification, is known as the Risorgimento. And even after the Risorgimento, he had become a symbol of the New Italy. But he drew great inspiration from Schiller. He wrote 4 operas based on Schiller plays. One, Giovanna d'Arco, that's Joan of Arc. One which was called The Robbers, that's Die Räuber by Schiller. And it's called I Masnadieri by Verdi. Another, a particular favorite of mine, is Louisa Miller, which was based on a work called Kabale und Liebe. And Louisa Miller is a particular favorite of mine, and so much so that my wife and I called our first daughter Louisa for that reason. Largely because I find Father Miller to be one of the most enlightened fathers that one encounters. You know, fathers are a mixed bag in Italian opera, and Verdi spends a lot of times returning to the theme of the plight of the tragic father. Don Carlo will not be an exception to that because there's a very tragic father in it. But Mr. Miller is an enlightened father, and though of course he has a tragic plight, as all the rest of them does, he is a very wonderful man. And the 4th opera, and most important, based on Schiller, is Don Carlo, which is also the closest one to its original source. But Schiller himself was not the first person to write about Don Carlos and the court of Spain. In fact, rumors, gossip, calumny, all those things contributed to people's understanding of the royal family of the time. And it starts out with this man, César Vichard de Saint-Réal, who's known also as Abbé Saint-Réal, was a polyglot historian, writer, and he wrote the romanticized novel about Don Carlos. And it was from this romanticized novel that Schiller took as a starting point. Although Schiller did a considerable amount of historic research, he took the romance from Abbé Saint-Réal, and he built on that. And so what we're getting in Verdi is already third hand. We have the Don Carlos and the court of history. We have the romanticizing of that story from Saint-Réal. We have and in between Saint-Réal and there is Schiller, there are also many other exponents of that story. Schiller gives us a very grandiose work, which is also a mouthpiece for his views on the importance of the liberation of all peoples and the equality of all human beings, and becomes that mouthpiece. And Verdi takes a part from Schiller and works on it further. So in fact, the story, when you go to the opera to see Don Carlo, you are not seeing exactly who King Philip II of Spain was, or Don Carlo, or his wife. You are seeing an interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation. That's what makes opera. In fact, at no time in history has opera, and by saying opera I mean those who wrote the music or those who wrote the text, felt an obligation to be faithful to their sources. That means, if they are historical sources, it means that the obligation that opera feels for itself is not to report accurately what actually happened in history, any more than it was, for instance, the obligation of Tchaikovsky to be faithful to the spirit of Pushkin when he makes his own version of Eugene Onegin, as an example. The only obligation that the operatic composer and the writer of the text feels is to make a coherent, dramatic entity that is inherently convincing, moving to whatever public is going to hear that music and see that drama put on the stage. In other words, it poses questions to itself, and if it successfully answers those questions through the composition, it is a success. It is not opera does not judge itself on, well, did I actually faithfully execute the will or the viewpoint of the original author? Verdi, of course, more than any other of his contemporaries, went to highly literary sources and dramatic sources outside of Italy. There are 3 Shakespeare operas, and his lifelong ambition was to write a 4th. He wrote Othello, he wrote Falstaff, he wrote Macbeth. He would have liked to have written King Lear, but he never managed to do that. There are 3 Shakespeare operas. There are 4 Schiller operas. There are a dozen operas taken from French sources. There are 3 or 4 sources taken from Spanish sources. It is interesting to note how rarely he consulted Italian dramatists or authors. In France, of course, he was the Italian composer, and so he was subject to a lot of the criticism, the critics of France. I, who was music director of the Paris Opera for 9 years, know very well what it means to be in the midst of Parisian critics. Where Verdi complained, they all had an opinion and everybody knew better than everybody else. Certainly they knew more than the composer, he would complain. So it's not surprising to see a caricature that looks something like that. 1867, you see him there with the hurdy-gurdy, and he was also known as Hurdy-Gurdy Verdi. In English-speaking countries. But of course, you and I and all of us, we all know that he is, of course, he is a great composer, and they knew it too, really. They just didn't want to always admit it. That I've gotten ahead of myself. I'm going to leave you with Verdi for a moment. There are 2 operas that you will have heard referenced: Don Carlos and Don Carlo. So what's the difference? Why is one Don Carlos and the other Don Carlo? The Don Carlos refers to the opera Verdi wrote for Paris, the original version, which was premiered in 1867, and it was called Don Carlos because Carlos is the original name. In Spanish, it's Don Carlos. In German, for Schiller, it was Don Carlos. It was Don Carlos for everybody until it got to Italy, and then it became Don Carlo. So if you hear reference to Verdi's Don Carlos, they are referring to an opera in 5 acts, originally sung in French, and was premiered in 1867. Now, from the very beginning, the problems with the work were its length. It didn't fit into opera theaters where it was exported after that. And so people started cutting it right away. Now, there are, in the end, actually 7 different versions of this opera, which is extraordinary. Now, you'll never hear all 7 of them. I myself have not heard quite a number of those versions. But if you count them, they start with the opera he delivered to the Paris Opera when he started rehearsing. All revisions were made until the dress rehearsal, which represents a 2nd version. The dress rehearsal was so long that people could not get back home at a proper time, and it went over midnight, and even then there was a problem with the employees in an opera house that were not supposed to work after midnight. So Verdi himself was forced to make cuts between the dress rehearsal and the premiere, and that premiere becomes a 3rd version, and that 3rd version is what is now referred to as the 5-act version of Don Carlo in French. Subsequently, there was to be another version made for Napoli, and then Verdi's full revision in 1884 for Milan, where, of course, the opera was translated into Italian, and it was shortened into 4 acts. I think if we see that, we can see a facsimile there of the cover of the original score for the Milan version in 1884. So you can see between 1867 and 1884, there are some 15 years. More than 15 years. So Verdi had another chance at revision. And the most important difference is that the 5-act version was reduced to 4 by cutting the first scene. Now, I think it's time for me to talk history a little bit and try to explain this wonderful opera and who are its protagonists. The real protagonist, though he's not the title, is King Philip II, who is the son of the Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and Isabella of Portugal. He is the father of Don Carlos. This is a portrait by Antonio Moro made in the 16th century. As you can see from the length of his reign, he is considered one of the major figures in world history. He was the king of Spain at the height of the Spanish Empire. It was for him and that empire that the expression, "it was the empire upon whom the sun never sets," it was originally for King Philip. Now, Queen Victoria and the British took over in the 19th century and appropriated that famous compliment to itself because it was also true. But at the time, King Philip was the man, and the Spanish Empire was the most powerful in the world. So he has a son by his first wife, and this is Don Carlos. And Don Carlos will be the hero of our opera. Now, in fact, he is much more a hero in the opera than he was in real life. The real Don Carlos was clearly a child with considerable handicaps, mental handicaps, given to great rages, inability to learn, inability to concentrate, was given to violence. In short, he did not please his father, King Philip II. Philip II was concerned because he did not feel that he was going to be a proper heir, and he was the only son. But to get a picture of what's going on, we have to go back a few years, back to the end of the 15th century, to the king and queen Ferdinand and Isabella, who are known as Los Reyes Católicos, not just because they were Catholic, but because they, in essence, became the protection, or felt that they were protecting Catholicism, not just in Spain, but wherever Spanish influence could find itself. Ferdinand was actually the king of Aragon, and Isabella was the queen of Castile, and by marrying, they combined the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile, which was the biggest step, to be followed by other somewhat smaller steps in becoming modern Spain. So you can see it here on the, you can see, if I can use that, there's Castilla, look this large, that's where that was Isabella, and here's Aragon. Castilla, of course, being Sevilla and Madrid, and Aragon, of course, where one finds Barcelona. So this is what Spain, most of modern Spain consisted of these two great kingdoms. And so they begin a reign, of course, where in order to have Catholicism dominate, they, in 1492, in addition to sending off Columbus with 3 ships, and as we learned in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all learned that in elementary school. A far more, well, I should say, an equally important, and in this case, a destructive and a tragic event took place. They expelled from Spain all of the Muslims and all of the Jews. And by so doing, they of course, displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and those who remained, who, if they did not convert to Catholicism, they were considered heretics and were often punished for that. So if I now give you an idea, let's have a look at how we end up with Don Carlos. You'll see Don, this is not, there we go, it's hard to see on a white surface, but you'll see Don Carlos down in the lower left hand. You'll look up to his parents, King Philip II. They will both be characters in the opera. The wife of King Philip, Maria Manuela of Portugal, is dead, of course, before the opera takes place. His second wife was Mary Tudor, of the Queen of England. So for a while, the King of Spain and the Queen of England were married. Now, Mary Tudor, I am told, never came to Spain. She remained the entire time in England. But nevertheless, they were married. Now, we know Mary Tudor to be the one of the daughters of King Henry VIII, the other daughter, of course, being Elizabeth, who was to become Elizabeth I. And you'll see that her mother was Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon was the first of King Henry's many wives, and you will see that Catherine of Aragon is, in fact, the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon. So we go down the other side, and we see daughter, she's called Joanna of Castile in English, but she was known in Spanish as Juana la Loca, which means Juana, the crazy woman, or the mad woman. Now, she had an extraordinary life. You will see that she lived for a very long time, and she was nominally the Queen of Spain until the time of her death. But her life is a tragic one. She married, you see, Philip I, the King of Castile, but he was actually from Flanders. He was from the lowlands. He was from what is now Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. And he was also known as Filippo el Hermoso, Philippe the Handsome, because he was very handsome. And he was pleasing to many women, and he spent his life being pleased by those women and pleasing them. This was an unfortunate combination with Juana, because Juana was extremely jealous and was given to mad fits, and by this she developed a reputation for being crazy. But it's not quite sure that she was all that crazy. She was jealous and she was angry, and I think in modern days we would have looked at it quite differently. But it became convenient to three important men in her life that she was somehow sidelined. She was to be betrayed by her father, her husband, and her son. She was betrayed by her father, who was happy to commit her to a convent to get her out of the way because she was ruled. She was judged to be too crazy to rule. She was betrayed by her husband, in not just in terms of infidelity, but he went along with that so that he could become the heir apparent and king of Castile. He was punished by God by developing typhoid fever and dying very young. So he never got to really reign for very long. But that's why he found it convenient to keep her in the convent. And you will see that their son is Charles V. He was known first as Charles I of Spain, but when he was elected Holy Roman Empire, he becomes Charles V. He is the son of Juana la Loca, and he found it convenient to leave his mother in the convent because she, of course, was the queen. Nominally, she would have ruled, and he wanted to rule himself. So that tragic life, which is not the subject of our opera, but it is a very interesting life. So we see Charles V marries a woman, Isabella of Portugal, and their son is King Philip. Now, what does this mean? It means that Don Carlos's grandfather is one of the most important figures in European history as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And his father is one of the most important figures, King Philip II. So that's a big role to try to fill that's big shoes to fill. And he's not able to fill them, or he's not going to be able to fill. And that becomes a problem to him. I just want to notice for anybody who's interested, Philip II, there's a great deal of inbreeding. Isabella and Ferdinand were cousins. They had to get a papal dispensation to get married. The Pope, who was one of Pope Paul, I think he was the second Pope Paul, he didn't give them that dispensation, so they decided to write their own fraudulent papal bull themselves and got married. The Pope was angry at them for the rest of his life, but they were cousins. Now, if you go down a little bit further, Manuela, was Princess of Portugal, was also a relative of King Philip II. So that if Don Carlos is born with some defective mental capacities, it may very well be due to the inbreeding. Inbreeding doesn't stop there. If you take a careful look, you will see that Mary Tudor is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who is the daughter of Ferdinand, which means that King Philip's grandmother is also the mother of his wife, Mary Tudor. You didn't catch that, did you? Yeah. All right. Well, now, so Mary Tudor lives and dies. Of course, she never leaves England. She is, by the way, known as Bloody Mary. And Bloody Mary was the queen who tried to turn the clock back on her father's attack on the Roman Catholic Church by forming the Church of England. And she was, of course, punished and executed for her efforts. Elizabeth de Valois is the third wife of King Philip II, and she is the central female character in the opera we're about to see. She was the daughter of Henry II of France, and she was betrothed to Don Carlos. King Philip and Henri, the king had been warring with each other, and they decided they wanted to make peace. There was a peace treaty signed, and as a signal to that peace, King Philip decided to give his son to the young Elizabeth of Valois. In the meantime, the death of Mary Tudor. He decided, well, I need a wife. Why don't I marry Elizabeth de Valois myself? And so he does. Now, did that cause a problem in real life? No. But that's a great story. And Abbé Saint-Réal liked that story, and he romanticized it, so that now, in the new story, Elizabeth and Don Carlo are in love, and they are prevented from realizing that love because the father, King Philip, has cruelly chosen to marry instead of allowing his son to marry her. None of that happened. Elizabeth de Valois married King Philip, and all reports tell us that it was a relatively happy marriage. He was very devoted to her, and she, at least even if she missed France, she devoted herself to her new status in life as Queen of Spain. She was apparently one of the few people who was able to make some meaningful contact and have a amicable and cordial relationship with Don Carlos, but there is no evidence whatsoever that it was romantic or erotic. But that doesn't make a good play, and so Schiller took Abbé Réal's romanticized novel and turns it into a drama. And Verdi, who is obliged to make a soprano love a tenor and a tenor to love a soprano, is obliged to have that story, and so they do. So Elizabeth died, as you see, the same year as Don Carlos, and their deaths, one after another, seem to suggest to the people of Flanders who were bristling under the Spanish Empire that those who were protecting the rights of the people of Flanders, who were, of course, Protestants, because Don Carlo was somehow or other associated with defending their cause, as was Elizabeth, they felt that they were murdered, and that story took on a life of its own. Don Carlos was imprisoned by his father, and because he wouldn't eat, and he eventually died in prison. Elizabeth Valois died of natural causes and was much grieved. King Philip was much grieved. He finally marries Anna of Austria, who was a niece of his. I don't know. He must have gotten another papal dispensation for that. But our story is going to end there because we're interested. Who are we interested in here? We are interested in this group around here. Now, I'm going to show you a few more pictures. This is Juana la Loca on the left, and that is her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Remember, Catherine of Aragon being the daughter of Ferdinand, one of the king of the Reyes Católicos, and of course the first wife of Henry VIII. This is Philip the Handsome on the left there. Not according to this portrait, and there, of course, there's Juana la Loca there once again. They are the parents of Charles V, Emperor of the Roman Empire. And here he is, Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, born in 1500, dies in 1558. He is the son of a Philip the Handsome, and the father of another Philip II. Okay? Does he appear in the opera? Well, sort of, yes. There are three roles for basses in this opera, which is one of the concessions, or I should say one thing that went very well in France because it was the tradition of the Grand Opéra, which had been in style in France up until the 1850s, to have a lot of low voices. And so we have King Philip II, who is a bass. We have a character of a monk who appears at the beginning and the end of the opera. And the monk is meant to be either the ghost of the now deceased Carlo V, he's called Carlo, Charles V, or there are those who say that he actually is Charles V walking around in monk's robes. Now, where does that come from? Well, that comes from history. In fact, Charles V abdicated to his son. He was tired and weary of the affairs of state. He was in increasingly ill health, and he chose to go into a monastery. And he went into that monastery, and we're going to see that monastery when the curtain goes up on Don Carlo on Saturday night. Now, the first thing we're going to hear, actually, is we're going to hear this monk talking about the deceased Charles V. However, it is one of the rumors that swirled around at the time was that Charles V staged his own death and funeral, and actually because he wanted to get first of all he wanted to get rid of all of his enemies so that they would think he was dead, that nobody would come looking for him in the monastery, and he wanted to have peace and quiet there. So it is actually possible that he walked around. Well, we know he was a monk, and it is possible that he walked around after the announcement of his death, and that he wasn't a ghost, but people thought he was a ghost. Now, did Giuseppe Verdi think he was a ghost, or did he think he was actually Charles V alive? Verdi himself was confused on the subject, and he wrote one letter to his librettist. He says, I'm still not straight, I'm paraphrasing, well, I'm still not straight about all this. Is that Charles V, or is that his ghost? The end of the opera is spine-chilling in its power when this ghost or Charles V appears and terrifies his son Philip II, terrifies his grandson, although he protects Don Carlo, and terrifies Elizabeth de Valois. But it's not clear who he really is. And does Verdi believe in ghosts? Well, yes, he uses ghosts elsewhere. But the problem with this one is that, did he mean this to be the real man? Then why are we having ghosts in this opera? Well, we already have another supernatural individual appear on the stage. Oh, not appear. We hear the voice of a celestial voice who appears to show redemption to the heretics who were about to be burned at the stake in the Alto da Fe. So, and because Schiller loved Shakespeare, and Verdi loved Shakespeare, and the shadow of Hamlet is to be felt in the Don Carlos of Schiller, it is very possible he means him to be a ghost. Here's Carlos V together with Pope Clement VII. Here he is on his horse. By the way, Charles V was not Spanish. He was born in Ghent, which is now in Belgium. It was a Habsburg, and he brings the Habsburgs into the family in Spain. And so he did not have much sympathy for Spain, and he was well loved in Flanders. Philip was 100% Spanish and did not like the people in Flanders, and they did not like him. This is, whoops, I'm sorry, let me get that back. That is Charles V, meeting for the first time his son, Juan of Austria. Why is he meeting him for the first time? Because he was illegitimate. And this is a presentation that has been memorialized here in this painting. That makes him the half-brother of King Philip II, and in fact, they were allies, and they together went on several missions to continue to slaughter Muslims who were still to be found in Spain at the time, and to make the conquest of the south of Spain secure. This is the wife of Charles V, so she's the mother of King Philip II. Here we see King Philip and Charles V. This is Tiziano is the painter here. There he is again, King Philip II of Spain. Here he is with his first wife. She is the mother of Don Carlo. That's Don Carlo down here, the small page. That's his mother, and that's his father, King Philip II. Here he is. His official title is Prince of Asturias. And there's a very handsome Don Carlo on the stage. If anybody wants a rare copy of that, I have one right here. This is Plácido Domingo, of course, the beautiful young Plácido Domingo, on the cover of a French opera magazine as singing Don Carlo. Now, in fact, he is now a baritone, and he is now singing another character in the opera, Rodrigo, the Marchese di Posa. But I wanted to show you what he was like in his heyday, because he was one of the great Don Carlos of the world. And there he is, as you will see him when you come to LA Opera. He is now Rodrigo, whom I have not mentioned until now, and I will mention shortly, because he is the only non-historical character or important character in the opera. He is a creation, not of Schiller, but he is a hero to Schiller, because he will become the mouthpiece for Schiller and the mouthpiece for freedom, for equality, for all of the Enlightenment concepts that we have talked about. And Verdi, who was always on the side of the common man, will find him a convenient hero for himself. Just to finish the royal family, there's Bloody Mary on the left, the second wife of Philip II. And there she is, happily the two of them sitting, I guess, in England somewhere. So you can see a very warm couple there, as they say with each other. Here's Henry VIII, of course, and that's his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And we have already seen how she is the parent Marie Tudor. And here is Henry II of France. Whoops, sorry. There we are. There he is, embracing Philip II. In reality, they were supposedly signing this peace treaty in Cateau Cambrésis, but it was done by proxy. That meeting never occurred. But as it is for operas who do not feel they need to be true to history, nor do artists. And so they are expressing the joy at this peace treaty and its meaning, but it's not a bit historical. Now we're going to start. I'm going to leave the royal family. We're going to get to be talking about the Grand Inquisition and the big scene of the Auto da Fe. We're going to leave that image in front of you while I explain to you the character that Plácido Domingo is singing, whose name is Rodrigo, and he is the Marchese di Posa. He is the Marquis of Posa. He is unique in that he is the deep abiding friend. Don Carlos and Posa are friends from childhood. They are devoted to each other, and they are close also in their philosophies. What's extraordinary about that? Well, the formula of Italian operas, as parodied by George Bernard Shaw, is a soprano wishes to make love to a tenor, the tenor wishes to make love to the soprano, and the baritone doesn't want them to do that and gets in their way. If you think about it, most Italian operas of the period can be reduced to that formula. What is extraordinary in this opera is that the baritone is the confidant and the closest friend of the tenor, and he does not want to get in the way of that love. He knows that it cannot be consummated, but he tries to help both of those. Now, he becomes also the confidant of the king, and the king, of course, will eventually be forced to betray him and to well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Auto da Fe. What is an Auto da Fe? Auto da Fe was a large exhibition, usually in the main plaza of any city, where the church could establish and visualize its dominance by punishing heretics. Who is a heretic? Anybody could be a heretic. A heretic was somebody who supposedly didn't believe in Catholicism or said some unsaintly thing at some point, or was a Jew or a Muslim who happened to be caught by the Inquisition, or were conversos, who were the Jews who converted on the surface to being Catholics, but in fact were still observing Judaism privately. Or it could be somebody that the king didn't like or the Inquisition didn't like. So we've had our own inquisitors in this country. We've had the McCarthy era. These are the periods when the rule of law begin to be frayed and are not applicable. People can be accused without proof, and they can be condemned without proof or due process. And that was commonplace at the time of the auto da fe. Auto da fe originally was a Portuguese word. It made a testimony or an act of faith. It wasn't so much an act of faith, although if on many auto da fe's, if the heretic were to repent, and their lives would be saved. But these actually became great political shows, and it was to reinforce the power of the king and the Inquisition. These are scenes from our production. Ana Maria Martinez as the queen, and there's King Philip Ferruccio Forlanetto. Here we see Queen Elizabeth de Valois with the third wife of Philip II, and of course in the opera she is in love with Don Carlo and he with she. Here she is in this French painting made much later in 1858, just shortly before the premiere of Verdi's Don Carlos. Elizabeth is leaving France to go to Spain and become the queen. And so there they are together in our story. They are in love with each other, though in history they were not. And here's the fourth wife. We'll never see her because she happens after the opera. Niece of Philip II, but nevertheless his fourth wife. She is the mother of Philip the third, and from Philip III comes Philip IV, who you see many portraits because he was, of course, the patron of Velázquez, the great Spanish painter, and you will see lots of, begin to notice the protruding chin and the large lips because that is a Habsburg characteristic. Here is the tomb of, it's not the tomb, it is the cenotaph of a memorial to King Philip at the It didn't come out quite well, but he's there with two of his wives, Maria and Elizabeth, and also Don Carlo is in the background. His first wife actually is not captured in this photo, and Mary Tudor didn't make it to the cenotaph because she is not buried in Spain. Here is the inquisitor at the time of Philip II. His name was de Espinosa. I'm not going to say he was a nice guy, but he's not as bad as the one you're going to see in the opera. All right? But who was as bad as the one you're going to see in the opera was the big inquisitor of the end of the 15th century, and you'll notice that's the time of Ferdinand and Isabella. He was Torquemada, and he was big and cruel, and he was the one who really began to spread the power and the omnipotence of the Grand Inquisition. The next one, I don't know anything about him, but I love the picture. And that's another one, and that is, of course, an El Greco, who I really feel captures the character there very, very, very well. This is a auto da fe, where the heretics are going to be burned. You see heretics over here being prepared, or up here. This is the detail, of course, of that. It says Saint Dominic presiding over the auto da fe. Of course, that was the belief of the Dominican friars who were in charge of the Inquisition. I don't know if Saint Dominic was really presiding from heaven over the auto da fe or would even have approved, but the Dominicans were, of course, the friars who were in charge of the Inquisition. This is another character who actually has a basis in history, and she appears in the opera, and it is very important, although none of the things she does in the opera are actually known to have ever happened. They probably did not. But she made her way into Saint-Réal's romanticized history, and she made her way into Schiller, and therefore she's in Verdi's opera. Why is she in Verdi's opera? Because we all know it's very convenient to have a baritone or a bass who opposes the soprano and the tenor from making love to each other, as George Bernard Shaw, but there's nothing better than another woman who is a rival, because the second soprano, now called a mezzo-soprano, Her basic function is to be a rival to the soprano, and Eboli is just that. Her name is the Princess of Eboli. She was a beautiful woman, we are told, and she also became very active in the court, mainly as an intrigante, which she will be worthy of her reputation in the opera by betraying both Don Carlo and Elizabeth, and then repenting for it at the end. Why does she have that patch on her eye? She is no relationship to Wotan from the Ring. She is not one of his daughters, but apparently she wore that patch. That's also a subject of why she wore it. Nobody knows. Did she have a bad eye just to make herself fascinating? Nobody seems to know. And by the way, on many of the paintings, internal evidence is that the patch was added later, more or less to correspond with the myth. This is El Escorial. For those of you that have been there, I don't need to explain it. But this magnificent, mighty summer home of King Philip was the equivalent of Versailles of Louis XIV. But if you know Versailles and if you know El Escorial, you know the difference. Versailles, everything is about elegance and illumination and light and entertainment. This is no entertainment there. It's severe and sober and frightening in many ways. Well, but King Philip, in his famous monologue in the third act, says, "I will rest only in El Escorial when I die." That's an anachronism, one of the many in the opera. At the time of the opera, El Escorial had not even been begun to be built. And it, in fact, took so many decades to build that it's an expression in Spanish. Un obra de El Escorial means a work of El Escorial means something that takes forever. We all know that. We all know how long it's been. The 405 has been working on. That is an obra de Escorial, and to any born or adoptive Italian, we all know that there are obras del Escorial all over Italy, things that just simply seem to take centuries. Okay, there it is today. Here's another view. Here's a picture of its construction. You note the year is 1576. Our opera ends in 1558. Here's a painting closer to the time. You'll see that that monk piously reading his scriptures or prayer book there. And this is this is where the tomb of the kings. I've been down there. It's so cold you can see your own breath in summer. All the kings are there. They're there. Philip is there. Carlos Quinto is there. It is a very impressive site. I first visited El Escorial in 1979 when I was to conduct Don Carlos for the first time. It happened to be my debut at the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. That's almost 40 years ago. And I swore to myself as a teenager who already loved Don Carlos that I would never conduct Don Carlo if I hadn't been to El Escorial. So I made arrangements to go there for 4 days. And just before I went there, I happened to be working at the Met with Placido. And I said, Placido, I'm going to Spain for the first time. I'm going to El Escorial. I'm conducting Don Carlos, blah, blah, blah. But then I'd like to go to Madrid and see, what shall I see in Madrid? He says, oh, I have just the person for you. I have a great friend, and here's her number. Call her up and tell her that I give you her number, and she'll show you around. Well, Placido gave me a great gift because not just she, but her best friend and her best friend's entire family have been friends of a lifetime, and 40 years later, we are still in constant contact. In fact, I needed some help preparing today's speech, and I simply sent her WhatsApp, and she sends the answers. So. This is the monastery of Yuste, referred to in the opera as San Giusto, where Charles V sought refuge when he abdicated, and it will open and close the opera. And it is where the King Philip goes to pray. Elizabeth goes there to pray. And outside of the San Giusto, we will see first Elizabeth relaxing. It's a central point in the opera. Unfortunately, we didn't have a more evocative photo. It is beautiful, but this, I didn't mean to go on to this just so quickly. This is the Cathedral of Valladolid, where the Auto de Fe is performed, I should say, because it really was a political performance. But unfortunately, the cathedral wasn't built at the time the opera takes place. But that doesn't stop any of us. Here it is, as you can see from the dates. Construction began long after the opera and was not finished for 100 years. Here's a portrait, probably totally fictitious, of Don Carlos watching an auto da fe with King Philip, with a nice Dominican watching on. They all look very pious in this particular photos. Notice King Philip's hat. That's what he wore. He did not wear a crown. Here's a major painting of an auto da fe, which you can see in the Prado, I believe, in Madrid. And here are the hats that they were forced to wear. The hat was called a corota. It was conical. It looked like a clown somewhat. And the tunic was known as a San Benito. That was what they were dressed in when they were marched through the streets at the Auto da Fe. This is by Goya, by the way, this sketch. Adolf Sachs, what's he doing in here? Well, you know he is the inventor of the saxophone. How did he find his way into my lecture? At the premiere of Don Carlos in Paris, every opera had a banda, what's called a banda. It means band. It means instruments that play off stage. And so there's a magnificent banda in the Auto da Fe scene in Don Carlos, and it was conducted by none other than Adolf Sachs, who invented the saxophone. I thought that was a cute story. I only learned it this year. I didn't know that after all these years. So I just thought I'd throw him in here along with all these other presents. So now we're meeting the characters. Don Carlos, this is Ramon Vargas who's singing Horace. That is Ana Maria Martinez who's singing Elizabeth, the Queen. There is Placido Domingo as Rodrigo Marchese di Posa. This is Eboli in a fit of penitence after having betrayed both the Queen and Don Carlos. And we have a authentic patch on her eye, which is fine, except it makes it very difficult for her to see me. And that is annoying to me at times, because she can't actually see me as well if I'm on the wrong side. But she's a fantastic, Anna Smirnova, Russian soprano actually, and is a great musician, so she doesn't really need to see me because she's so good. Here's Ferruccio Forlanetto as King Philip. He does wear a crown because operatic King Philips always have a crown because he refers to it himself. And there's the Grand Inquisitor. This is Morris Robinson, one of our favorites at LA Opera, who has a brief cameo appearance, but it is expanded over the appearance of the Grand Inquisitor in Schiller, and I might add is 10 minutes of the most chilling and magnificent music Verdi ever penned, or anybody. I would say it's a unique scene, the confrontation between head of state and head of church, although nominally the king is the head of the church. But we see the Inquisitor bend the king to his will. And Verdi, as I mentioned, revised the opera several times. He never touched a note of his original conception. It sprung forth like Venus from a shell, in perfect form from the very beginning, and it is worth the price of the ticket. Those 10 minutes alone are a masterwork, unsurpassed and unduplicated in the history of Italian opera. There's Eboli begging the forgiveness of Queen Elizabeth because she's explaining that she was the one who betrayed her by stealing her private belongings and some letters from Don Carlo and delivering them to the king. She is also about to confess to him that, by the way, I accused you of adultery, but I myself have committed the same sin as I accused you, and with whom? With the king. So she has a right to be upset with herself. And then sings a magnificent aria, of course. That is a picture of the ghost who is wandering around the Yuste monastery, the ghost of Charles V. We've sort of made the decision he's a ghost in this production. but I like leaving it sort of open. Remember, he's Don Carlos's grandfather, and so the fact that he comes and appears on 2 occasions when Don Carlos happens to be in Yuste, for me, is no accident. It's that way for a reason. Here's Ana Maria Martinez again as Elizabeth de Valois. And there she is again. And that's our final. I'll leave you with that final image. Now, when I say that Don Carlos is an imperfect masterpiece, it is the favorite opera of many people who love Italian opera, and of the Verdi fans, there are many who believe it to be his greatest work. And I can be tempted into that position. That's even in the face of his final 2 masterpieces, which are Otello and Falstaff, which undisputably, not just masterworks, they are perfect works. You know, what's a perfect work? When you get everything right, there's not one note too many or one too few, and every note that's written is on an equally high level of inspiration. Now, we can't say that for Don Carlo. It's an imperfect work, but who's to say that imperfect works aren't great art? They are. And one has the feeling he never completely finished it. But then incompleted works, Schubert's Unfinished Symphony is a masterwork. So many of Michelangelo's sculptures are unfinished, and yet every one of them is a masterpiece. And so I will say that so is Don Carlo. The difficulty for Verdi writing for the French theater was that it was a structure he was not used to or comfortable with. Every French drama since the time of Racine, Molière, Beaumarchais had to have 5 acts. All French operas had 5 acts, even the non-conventional ones written at the end of the 19th century, like Pelléas and Mélisande, has 5 acts. Verdi was a composer about concision. He did not like things going on and on and on. And he found 5 acts cumbersome. So that was one of the difficulties that he had to deal with. The Grand Opéra was an art form that was based on the idea of splendid, enormous scenery, great crowd scenes, light political dramas, but it was all about the visual. The musical sort of accompanied. The great exponent, who was a man of genius who is underestimated today, was Meyerbeer, who was basically the king of Grand Opéra in France. But Verdi was not a man who was about those big splendiferous, but he managed to write this Auto da Fe. That was for him difficult.
Excuse me, I don't want to interrupt, but there's no air here. Can you open a door or something?
Of course. If there's no air, we should open. I hope that will be better for you shortly. The AC is on. Well, I hope some air will give you a little comfort. No. Too many people. It's our fault. Stop breathing, please. I hope you'll be more comfortable, ma'am, shortly. The difficulty of writing in French is another difficulty. It was not his language. He didn't speak French. He could understand it. His wife did most of the correspondence for him in French when he needed to. The problem with Don Carlos in the 5-act version is the same problem with Les Vêpres Siciliennes, the Sicilian Vespers in French. For me, anyway. There are those who insist and say you must do Don Carlos in French because he wrote it in French. And he meant it to be in French. I understand that viewpoint, and I also believe that there are more than one legitimate version of Don Carlo, as is often the case with many works. There are many works where there are more than one version. Pierre Boulez wrote brilliantly on this subject and said, there's no law that says there has to be a single version of a musical piece. And he wrote himself several pieces where he wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it and left them all behind. What are we supposed to say to Monet? Which cathedral of Rouen is the real version? Or to the Prigioniere of Michelangelo. So the fact is that there can be many versions, and they're all legitimate. I myself have never conducted the French version, but if I had an opportunity, I would. The big choice for most of us is, do you do it in Italian in 5 acts or 4 acts? The scene that is cut is the first scene, is in Fontainebleau. It is the one in which Carlos and Elizabeth meet each other, fall in love, and at the end of that scene, the Spanish messengers come in and say, King Philip has decided to marry you herself, and let's all rejoice. So, of course, everybody rejoices, and they both are crushed by this. But the four-act version omits that. Now, some people say that's a pity and that's a shame. You lose all that beautiful music. And I say, yes, to a degree that's true. But there's another element that I think one should take into account. That sometimes the entire story of love is delivered to us in reminiscence. We know that they fell in love. We know that she's now married to King Philip, who is Don Carlos's father. We know the impossibility of their love. And we suffer with them for that reason. But sometimes an imagined scene is actually more powerful in the audience's imaginations than actually seeing it. Verdi characteristically does not show people falling in love in his operas. It's usually a given at the beginning of an opera. And so, in a way, he's more at home when it's a remembered love. It is not, when Mimi walks through the door into Rodolfo's garret there, and it's a magical moment. Puccini loves that. He's able to do it a second time in Madame Butterfly. He loves that. That wasn't Verdi's thing. He likes to recall a love, so it's perfectly consistent. But I think the greater strength of the four-act version is that it opens and closes in the monastery, and the presence of the supernatural is established from the very, very first note. And I want to just play you the introduction, if I may. If I can get the most extraordinary music played on by four horns, almost atonal. It's not really for the era of Verdi. What he's saying here is there is a great mystery, and that mystery is supernatural. It's the mystery of Charles V. It's the mystery of the supernatural. But we're at a grave, and we also realize that the power, the omnipotence, not just of God, but of the Roman Catholic Church, as personified by the King and the Grand Inquisition, is present from the very first sounds of this opera. And the opera will close also in the monastery with the appearance of the ghost and the reestablishment of the power of the Inquisition and the the power of the supernatural. For believer or non-believer, Catholic or not Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, it doesn't matter. One feels through this music the force of that the supernatural and religion has played on the imagination of human beings. Verdi himself was an agnostic, almost an atheist, and he was deeply anti-clerical. And that anti-clericism went back to his childhood. And so you can imagine the opportunity, the muse that inspired him when he had a chance to not just to lampoon just a priest, but to lampoon the Grand Inquisitor of Spain, called forth from him a power that was immeasurable. You'll hear the chanting of the monks in the background, and their chant becomes a motive that will come back during the course of the opera. And then you will hear this mysterious voice, who very often you do not see on the stage. And that is Charles V or his ghost. You get to choose. Now, either way, he's very impressive. Now, normally I play a lot more music at my pre-performance talks at the opera, but I decided to do it this way tonight because I wanted to bring you a lot of pictures and give you a lot of historical background. Now, you'll get all the music, or as much of the music as I can squeeze into 45 minutes when you come to Don Carlo, and you come an hour early. I highly recommend it. I talk for 45 minutes. You do have time to freshen up before the performance. 15 minutes you have to get from the foyer to your seats, but I will talk, and I play a lot of musical excerpts to sort of show you through the opera, and I do promise to do that. Also, I know they have kindly distributed a text that I write for my own pleasure, actually, but I like to share my thoughts on subjects. So if you didn't receive one, I think you can receive one on the way out, or you can find it on our website. It makes excellent reading late at night, put you to sleep probably, and so I highly recommend it too for that reason. But I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight and for listening to me, and I hope you will all be at Don Carlo.
So thank you so much, Maestro, for this very rich, detailed, historical presentation. Now, he's willing to take a few questions. I would say 3 questions from the audience. Thank you so much.
I love questions, not statements. Okay. I covered it all? Nobody has a question?
Yes. I just wanted to ask, when deciding on what language to present the opera in, whether it's for Don Carlo or Don Carlos, is the convention that the 5-act version is always in French and the 4-act version is always in Italian, or is it completely up to the artistic direction of the opera house?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is both. Actually, Don Carlos fell out of the repertory somewhere in the 1880s, 1890s, and was not to make a reappearance until well into the 20th century. Interestingly enough, it reappeared in Germany in a big way, which is not a surprise because, of course, being a Schiller play that everybody in Germany knows. So it made its appearance back in Germany, and then gradually it became known as a great masterpiece. By the way, Rudolf Bing began his well, we call it a reign, because that's those of us who grew up in those days in New York felt that he was a potentate. He opened his first season with Don Carlo in 1950, and it became a part of the Met repertoire. That's why I saw it as a teenager already. You have a choice between French and Italian. You have a choice between Italian in 5 acts or 4 acts. I myself, by the way, I have conducted, when I conduct on Saturday evening, it's going to be the 50th performance of Don Carlo, lifetime, and it's about my 7th time around with it. I have only conducted the 5-act version with the Fontainebleau scene once, and that was my debut in Covent Garden. And the next time I did Don Carlo, it's always brought me good luck, was actually my which was in reality my debut in Italy, which was Don Carlo to open the Maggio Musicale Fiorentino in 1985. And it was at the insistence of the artistic director, Fedele D'Amico, that it be in 4 acts. He believed deeply in the 4 acts version. By the way, Verdi himself said, it's much better this way, much more concise, it makes more sense. Now, you can justify it either way. And so basically once the 4-act version came into Italian, that's what most people did. And yet there was still another version with the 5th act in Verdi's lifetime in Italian, performed in Modena. And Verdi was not there. We do not know if he approved. We know he didn't disapprove because he didn't prevent it from happening. So it's an open question. My personal reason for not preferring French, though I love French, I love the language, and I love French music, and I was even a French resident for 10 years, I find a discord between the tenor of the French language and the essential Italianismo, if you'll forgive me for no other term, of the music of Verdi, which seems to be Italy incarnate. It seems to be, there is nothing more deeply Italian than Verdi. And so you have this deeply Italian music and the French language, for me, that creates a form of dissonance. And so, for that reason, I have always tended to prefer Italians. As for the Sicilian Vespers, I conducted it for the first time in France, in French. It was the first production in Paris, believe it or not, where it was premiered in 1855. It was the the second performance in French. It was never played in French again in Paris until 2002, when I conducted it at the Paris National Opera. I enjoyed the experience, of course, but then I subsequently conducted it in Italian, and I prefer that too, in Italian. Yes?
Yeah, was there anything going on in Verdi's lifetime historically in Italy that may have corresponded with what was going on with Don Carlos or King Philip and the dictatorship and that kind of thing?
If that's
Controversial at all?
Well, was it controversial, the opera? No. By this time, Verdi was so established that he could do no wrong. I mean, the French could still quibble. I don't think there was much quibbling anywhere else. I mean, Verdi's, except for from the Wagnerites. The Wagnerites, of course, look down their nose at everybody else, including Verdi. But was there any contemporary application? I would always give a caveat about looking for biography in the works of composers, and especially Verdi, because Verdi to me is a kind of Shakespeare who was able to set any subject, any character, any person into notes in that same inexplicable genius of a Shakespeare who seemed to have been able to understand situations which he could not possibly have known firsthand. So the genius of Verdi, transcends all of that. But there are issues, and some of those issues are contemporary now. Verdi loved the issue of love versus duty. That was that's an issue. That's a basic human emotion. How many of us can say we have never experienced the conflict between duty and love? And sometimes duty wins, sometimes love wins, sometimes it's a compromise, sometimes it's a catastrophe. Any of those things, but it's very human to feel that. Verdi returned over and over to the plight of the tragic father. There's possible autobiography in that, because Verdi lost his two young infant children young with his first wife, all lost within a year and a half when he was a very young man, and that the lack of those legitimate children was a lifelong tragedy for him. There are rumors on the street that there are illegitimate children wandering around the streets of Busseto, and today, but nothing has ever been substantiated. And by the way, it still doesn't make up for the loss of the illegitimate children and the family that he would have liked to have had with grandchildren, great-grandchildren. He would have certainly have had great-grandchildren, if not great-great-grandchildren, given the length of his life. So you see the plot of many operas with a tragic father, Rigoletto, the father figure. You see one here, King Philip, and what a father! I mean, that's an amazing story. The conflict of church and state is not treated in every opera by Verdi, but it was one that was close to his heart because of his anti-clericalism. Now, why is he anti-clerical? First of all, why was he maybe an agnostic? It's probably because growing up in Italy, which was 99.9% Catholic, the entire culture was Catholic. If you hated the church and if you hated priests, you probably ended up not believing in God. So was he a real agnostic? Maybe yes. Even his wife said he's very difficult to understand. I know of no man more moral. I've never met a man in my life more moral and with his standards, and yet he will not get down on a bended knee in a church. There is an apocryphal story, and it was first told me some years ago by a member of the Verdi family. And it was said it was always told in the family that Verdi was an altar boy in Le Roncole, which you can see, that's his birthplace, at a very young age, and he was serving at the altar and got distracted, and the theory was he was listening to the organ. He was probably, as a musical mind was taken with that organ. The priest got mad because he had forgotten to ring the bell, and so the priest kicked him down the altar stairs. Terrible. And Verdi said to him, "May lightning strike you." Already showing his character, because that was Giuseppe Verdi. And then, lo and behold, 8 years later, lightning struck the church and that priest was killed.
One last question, Maestro.
Now,
one last question.
Yeah, that's a story, right?
Grazie. Maestro, what is your example for a perfect opera?
Otello, Falstaff, The Marriage of Figaro. They're very hard to find. Maybe Parsifal, maybe Pelléas and Mélisande. Not Boris Godunov, though I consider it on the level of any of those works. In a certain sense, any of the mature Wagners are perfect, although one could not necessarily argue that there's not a note too many. But they are closer to opera. But in Verdi's output, no question, Otello and Falstaff, without a question. Yeah.
One more question, the last one. Who's going to be the lucky one? Over here. Okay.
Yeah, I was sort of interested in your early schooling. What teacher inspired you, and when did you say, "I want to be an opera conductor and live forever"?
No, I'm not going to say that I didn't have any teachers who inspired me, but the decision was 100% my own. I saw my first opera when I was 11. I was brought there by chance, not by design. There are no musicians in my family. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. None of them are musicians. My parents were not musicians. My grandparents were not musicians. I believe that both of my maternal great-grandfathers were musicians. I believe it only by deduction that my German great-grandfather was a musician, because some family heirlooms of a lot of organ manuals from the 19th century written in old German script were sent to me by an aging great-aunt, somebody or aunt, because I was a young musician in the family. But I do know that my Italian great-grandfather, who who was born in 1860 and emigrated from Basilicata to New York, married my great-grandmother, who was also from Basilicata, and produced 5 children, amongst them my grandmother, my most beloved grandmother, the favorite of the family. And he died in 1899 at the age of 39 years, though his widow held me in her arms when I was born. So she lived for over a century. That's the only genetic, maybe I have an atavistic gene. I know he was a musician because it's on his death certificate. That's the only way I know. I went to the opera. I fell in love with the opera at 11 years old. Within several months, my whole life changed. All I wanted to do was to hear music. It spread out from opera to classical music in general. I started studying the piano very seriously. I had an opportunity to sing in the children's chorus of a few operas. And by the time I was 13, Saul turning to Paul and falling off his horse, I said, I want to do that. I can do that. That's what I want to do all my life. I decided when I was 13 years old. You can imagine my parents' face when I came home and announced that, or my piano teacher's face. What? You want to be a conductor? Well, that's it. I made up my mind. I was determined to do it. And from that moment on, I put all of my concentration into how can I do this, because there was nobody there to teach you how to conduct when you're 13. But I did get into Juilliard by the time I was 18. I conducted my first concert by the time I was 19. I made a debut of sorts in Spoleto in Italy. Not Spoleto Charleston, conducting Boris Godunov. And by just before my 22nd birthday, I took over a production of La Bohème in the Juilliard School for an ailing Thomas Shippers. And because it was New York, and because every critic was there at that day, and those were the days when there were still 7 dailies in New York City, that was the beginning of my career. So it was all a miracle. It all happened in 10 years, and I am grateful to God that I was able to do with my life what I wanted to do, and I'm still doing it, and I'm grateful for every day, and I hope I'll be able to do it forever.
So, we'd like to thank very much Maestro James Conlon for his generosity. And we are very grateful, actually. We are, really are. Thank you. So you can grab on the way out at the LA Opera programs, and don't miss Don Carlos, of course. Don Carlo or Don Carlos, Don Carlo. Both, right? Well, now you know we all...
When it's in 4 acts in Italian, it's Don Carlo.
Yes, yeah, that was on purpose, you know. And please come back for our upcoming events in October. We'll have Hit Week for Music and the Week of the Italian Language, and also Italian Days of Contemporary Art. So if you're not a member, if you don't receive our programs, please sign up at the door at the front desk, and I will be glad to get your email address. And once more, thank you to LA Opera, and thank you so much, James. This is a true gift. Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you.